There's a specific kind of confusion that keeps so many people stuck for years, unable to name what they're actually living through because everything they've ever read about narcissism was built around a version that doesn't quite match the person standing in front of them. The grandiosity, the obvious arrogance, the loud, unmistakable hunger for admiration that announces itself the moment someone walks into a room. This is the image most of us carry when we hear the word narcissist. And it's not wrong exactly. It's simply incomplete, built primarily around a presentation that shows up more visibly, more publicly, more stereotypically in men. When the narcissist in your life is a woman, a mother, a sister, a best friend, a colleague you can't quite figure out, the pattern so often looks different enough that you spend years doubting your own perception, wondering if what you're experiencing even has a name, wondering if you're simply too sensitive, too demanding, too quick to see cruelty in someone everyone else describes as warm and generous. It has a name, it has a structure, and today we're walking through 6 of the most consistently observed traits in narcissistic women specifically, not because narcissism is fundamentally different depending on gender at some deep psychological level, but because socialization shapes how the same underlying structure gets expressed, which means recognizing it requires knowing precisely what to look for, rather than searching for a presentation that was never going to match in the first place. One important note before we begin, because it matters enormously for how you use everything we're about to discuss. These are patterns, not isolated moments. Every person, regardless of gender, occasionally says something competitive, occasionally plays the victim in an argument, occasionally cares deeply what others think of them. What we're describing today is something different. A consistent, pervasive combination of these traits, sustained over years, forming a coherent and reliable pattern, rather than an understandable human moment of weakness. Keep this distinction in mind as we move through each trait, because precision here protects you from misapplying a serious framework to someone who's simply having a difficult season, while also giving you language for something that's been genuinely damaging you for far too long without a name attached to it. Trait 1. Relational aggression instead of overt dominance. Where male narcissism often expresses itself through direct assertions of superiority, loud opinions, obvious one-upmanship, unmistakable displays of dominance in a room, female narcissism frequently operates through subtler, more socially embedded channels. Exclusion, rumor, strategic alliance building specifically designed to isolate a target rather than confront her directly. This might look like being quietly, gradually cut out of a friend group through whispered reframing of your character, delivered in tones of concern rather than obvious hostility. It might look like watching your reputation erode through comments strategically placed with just enough plausible deniability that no single sentence taken alone could ever be pointed to as clearly malicious. This form of aggression is uniquely disorienting precisely because it so rarely leaves obvious evidence behind. There's no single cruel outburst to point to, no dramatic confrontation anyone else directly witnessed. Instead, there's a gradual, cumulative erosion of your standing within a social group or family system, engineered so carefully, so incrementally, that by the time you finally recognize what's actually happening, significant damage has often already occurred, damage that's difficult to reverse precisely because it happened slowly enough that no one moment ever seemed serious enough to challenge directly while it was occurring. What makes this trait particularly insidious is how effectively it exploits your own instinct toward generosity and fairness. Because the aggression is indirect, because it's wrapped in apparent concern or reasonable-sounding social commentary, challenging it directly often makes you look paranoid or unreasonable, which means the person engaging in this behavior enjoys almost complete protection from accountability, precisely because her methods were never designed to be identifiable as aggression in the first place. Trait 2. Competitive comparison disguised as compliments or concern. Watch closely for a specific recurring pattern where praise or apparent care arrives with a subtle sting embedded somewhere inside it. You look so good. Did you finally start taking care of yourself? I'm just a little worried people will think you're trying too hard with that promotion. It's so brave that you're doing this at your age. Each of these comments performs a dual function simultaneously. They appear, on the surface, to be supportive or complimentary, while quietly, unmistakably positioning her as more insightful, more attractive, more socially perceptive, or simply more secure in her own status than you. This tactic is particularly effective because it operates with almost complete plausible deniability. If you push back, if you name the sting embedded inside the apparent compliment, you're immediately accused of misreading genuine concern as an insult, which leaves you looking oversensitive, defensive, unable to accept kindness graciously, rather than her looking unkind in any way that could be clearly identified or named. This dynamic, repeated across years, teaches you something devastating: that even her apparent generosity requires careful, exhausting decoding, that nothing offered to you can simply be received at face value without first checking for the competitive undertone hiding somewhere inside it. Trait 3. Victimhood used as a control mechanism. This trait often confuses people the most, precisely because it inverts the more familiar image of narcissistic grandiosity most of us carry. Rather than claiming obvious superiority, this presentation frequently centers around positioning herself as perpetually wronged, overlooked, mistreated. By you specifically, by circumstances generally, by nearly everyone who's ever crossed her path throughout her entire life. This chronic victim narrative serves a crucial, specific function. It makes her behavior nearly impossible to challenge or hold accountable, because any attempt at genuine confrontation gets immediately, reliably reframed as further evidence of exactly how unfairly she's treated, even by you, even now, in this exact moment. Genuine hardship deserves genuine compassion, and it's worth stating this clearly, because this trait can easily be misapplied to anyone who's ever experienced real difficulty and needed support processing it. What we're describing is distinct from this: a consistent, strategic, near-total unwillingness to ever occupy the role of someone who caused harm, regardless of the actual facts of any given situation, deployed specifically at moments when accountability would otherwise be required. Watch for how quickly and completely every conflict, regardless of its actual origin, eventually resolves into her being the one who suffered most, the one who needs comforting, the one whose pain requires your immediate attention, even in conversations that started with genuine harm she caused you specifically. Together, these first three traits reveal something crucial about why this particular presentation of narcissism so often goes unrecognized for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes. It doesn't announce itself the way more obvious grandiosity does, doesn't invite the kind of clear, easily nameable confrontation that more overt narcissistic behavior might eventually provoke. It hides inside relationships, inside apparent closeness, inside a persona that can look, to nearly every outside observer, like warmth, generosity, and genuine emotional depth, rather than what it actually is underneath that careful, consistent performance. Trait 4. Enmeshment disguised as closeness. This trait shows up most often in mother-daughter dynamics, in intense friendships, in romantic relationships that seem, from the outside, remarkably devoted, and it's among the hardest to recognize precisely because it initially feels like the exact opposite of a red flag. It presents as intense devotion, deep emotional investment, a closeness that can feel flattering, even genuinely enviable, especially to someone who's never before experienced this kind of concentrated attention and intensity directed specifically at them. Think about how this often begins, particularly in the mother-daughter version of this dynamic, since it's one of the most common and most difficult versions to identify. A mother who seems to understand you better than anyone else in the world, who wants to know every detail of your life, who positions herself as your closest confidant, your best friend, the one person who truly gets you in a way no one else ever could. This feels, initially, like exceptional closeness, exceptional love. the kind of bond many people spend their whole lives wishing they had with a parent. But watch closely, and a different pattern emerges underneath this apparent closeness, one that reveals something considerably more concerning than ordinary devotion. There's an expectation, rarely stated outright but consistently enforced, that your emotions, your decisions, your entire developing identity remain tethered closely to hers, with very little genuine tolerance for authentic separateness. Disagreement, even mild, reasonable disagreement, gets treated as a form of betrayal. Independent decisions, especially significant ones made without her input or approval, provoke a wounded, sometimes quietly punishing response, one that might not look like obvious anger, but that communicates unmistakably deep disappointment or hurt, requiring your immediate attention and repair. Boundaries, even entirely reasonable ones, needing space, disagreeing about a major life decision, simply wanting privacy about certain aspects of your life, get reframed consistently as coldness, as rejection, as evidence that you've somehow pulled away from a closeness that was supposedly sacred between you. This isn't love expressed with unusual intensity. It's a demand, largely unconscious on her part, but deeply consistent nonetheless, that you remain merged with her identity closely enough that your genuine autonomy itself starts to feel threatening to the relationship's continued existence. This pattern is particularly damaging precisely because it's so easily mistaken for genuine, admirable closeness, especially by people outside the relationship who witness only the visible intensity of devotion between you without ever recognizing the control quietly, consistently operating underneath it. Adult daughters raised inside this dynamic often struggle enormously with a specific, confusing question. How do you set a boundary with someone whose love language has always seemed to be total access? How do you claim separateness from someone who's never modeled what it looks like to love someone while still respecting where you end and she begins? This confusion isn't a personal failing. It's the direct, predictable consequence of growing up inside a relationship structure specifically designed to make genuine independence feel like abandonment. Trait 5. Image management centered on being perceived as the good one. This trait involves an intense, sustained, ongoing investment in maintaining a very specific public identity: the devoted mother, the endlessly loyal friend, the selfless caretaker, the reasonable, level-headed one in every conflict she's ever been part of, regardless of whether her private behavior actually matches this carefully curated, consistently reinforced public image. This isn't simple vanity, and it's worth distinguishing it clearly from ordinary human concern about reputation, because most people care at least somewhat about how they're perceived. What we're describing runs considerably deeper: a psychological need to be perceived, publicly and consistently, as fundamentally good, kind, and blameless, which means any private behavior that might contradict this carefully constructed image gets aggressively managed, minimized, or reframed the instant it risks becoming visible to anyone outside the immediate relationship. This often produces a specific, deeply confusing split for anyone genuinely close to her, one that generates real, lasting self-doubt over time. The person other people describe glowingly and consistently as warm, generous, endlessly supportive, wonderful to be around, bears little meaningful resemblance to the person you actually experience behind closed doors, in the moments no one else ever witnesses. And because this public image is so consistently, carefully, effectively maintained across every social context she inhabits, any attempt on your part to describe your genuine private experience to others frequently gets met with visible disbelief, sometimes even gentle correction, precisely because it directly contradicts an image that's been strategically constructed and consistently reinforced over years, sometimes decades. This specific dynamic explains something that confuses and isolates so many people trapped inside relationships with this particular presentation. The sense that no one would ever believe you if you actually described what happens when it's just the two of you, alone, away from the audience, her public persona depends on maintaining. This isn't paranoia. It's an accurate read of a genuinely difficult situation, one where the very success of her image management becomes another barrier standing between you and anyone who might otherwise validate what you're actually experiencing. Trait 6. Emotional volatility triggered specifically by perceived threats to status or admiration. While grandiose narcissism often produces obvious, consistent displays of superiority regardless of circumstance, this particular presentation tends to remain relatively stable, even pleasant and warm, right up until something specifically threatens her sense of being the most admired, most important, most central figure in a given situation or relationship. This might be someone else receiving attention or praise she believes should rightfully belong to her instead. It might be a genuine achievement of yours that inadvertently, entirely without malicious intent on your part, outshines something of hers in a way she experiences as diminishing. It might simply be a situation, a family gathering, a celebration, a conversation, where she isn't positioned as the central focal point everyone's attention naturally gravitates toward. When this specific trigger occurs, the response can shift with startling, genuinely disorienting speed, from warmth to sudden coldness, from apparent generosity to punishing withdrawal, sometimes escalating to outright rage that seems wildly disproportionate to whatever actually triggered it in the first place. This volatility, tied so specifically and consistently to perceived threats around status and admiration rather than to more ordinary relational conflict, often genuinely confuses people who've only ever encountered the warmer, more stable version of her personality, leaving them uncertain, sometimes for years, exactly what actually caused such a dramatic, unsettling shift in her behavior toward them. Together, these 6 traits, relational aggression operating through indirect social channels, competitive comparison disguised carefully as compliments or genuine concern, victimhood deployed strategically as a control mechanism, enmeshment consistently disguised as unusually devoted closeness, image management prioritizing perceived goodness above private honesty, and emotional volatility, specifically tied to perceived threats against status, paint a picture significantly, meaningfully different from the more commonly recognized, more overtly grandiose presentation most people automatically associate with the word narcissism. Understanding these 6 traits clearly is only genuinely useful if it leads somewhere, and here's where it actually needs to lead, into the far more difficult question of what you're supposed to do once you recognize this exact pattern in someone you can't simply cut out of your life the way you might end a casual friendship or leave a romantic relationship. Because so often this specific presentation shows up in mothers, sisters, lifelong friends, colleagues embedded deeply into your daily professional life, people woven so thoroughly into your family and social structure that just leave isn't a realistic, complete answer, even once the pattern becomes completely, undeniably clear to you. The first thing worth understanding is that clarity itself changes the relationship, even before you make any external decision about what to do with it. Once you can name relational aggression instead of experiencing it as vague, unexplainable social chaos you can never quite pin down or articulate to anyone else. Once you can recognize competitive comments disguised as concern instead of internalizing them as accurate, well-meaning feedback about your own shortcomings. Once you can see enmeshment clearly for what it actually is instead of continuing to mistake it for exceptional closeness worth treasuring. You stop being so thoroughly disoriented by the pattern, even while it's actively happening in front of you or directed at you. This shift alone is genuinely significant, because so much of what makes this particular dynamic so exhausting isn't simply the behavior itself in isolation. It's the constant, corrosive self-doubt it produces, the endless internal questioning about whether you're somehow the unreasonable one, the oversensitive one, the one genuinely at fault in every conflict that somehow always seems to end with her needing comfort instead. The second thing worth understanding involves documentation, and it matters considerably more than it might seem to in any given moment. Because the image management trait we discussed, her carefully maintained and consistently reinforced public persona, means that your private experience will almost always be disputed, minimized, or outright disbelieved if you ever attempt to describe it accurately to someone else who only knows her carefully curated public version. Keeping your own private record, even if it's simply for your own reference and reassurance, of specific incidents, specific comments, specific recurring patterns, protects your own confidence in your own memory over time, especially inside a dynamic that specifically, systematically depends on you growing increasingly uncertain about your own perception and your own recollection of events. The third thing involves genuinely recalibrating what closeness is actually allowed to look like moving forward, rather than assuming the relationship must either continue exactly as it has, unchanged, or end completely and permanently. If enmeshment has defined the relationship for years, the healthiest response isn't necessarily complete, total severance. Though for some people, in some specific circumstances, that genuinely does become the right and necessary choice. For many others, though, it's a genuine, deliberate redefinition of exactly how much access she's granted to your decisions, your emotional world, your daily life going forward. Engagement without total merger, continued presence in your life without the ongoing requirement that your autonomy remain permanently available for negotiation, discussion, or subtle punishment whenever you exercise it. The fourth thing, and perhaps the most important of everything we'll discuss today, involves releasing the deep, understandable expectation that genuine accountability will ever arrive in the specific form you've been hoping for, waiting for, perhaps for years or even decades. Given the victimhood pattern we discussed at length earlier, direct confrontation about specific incidents or specific patterns of harm rarely produces genuine acknowledgement or authentic ownership. It typically produces a reversal instead, one where you somehow, confusingly, end up comforting her about how hurt and misunderstood she feels by your accusation, regardless of how carefully, how gently, or how fairly you originally raised the concern. Understanding this pattern in advance before you attempt another round of hopeful confrontation protects you from repeatedly seeking a resolution that this particular psychological structure was genuinely never built to offer you, no matter how many times or how many different ways you try to reach it. There's a fifth thing worth naming too, one that often gets overlooked in conversations like this: grief. Because recognizing these 6 traits clearly in someone central to your life, especially a mother, especially someone who was supposed to be your first and safest source of unconditional love, involves a genuine loss worth acknowledging directly rather than rushing past. You're not simply gaining useful information or a helpful new framework, you're also losing something you may have spent years, even decades, hoping might eventually be true: the fantasy that she was capable of the depth of care, the reciprocity, the genuine attunement you deserved and needed from her. This grief is real, and it deserves space rather than being minimized simply because the practical protective insights we've discussed today feel more immediately useful or actionable. What all of this ultimately builds toward is something we've returned to throughout many conversations like this one. Not a demand that she change, not some clever strategy specifically designed to finally make her see herself clearly, because that outcome likely isn't available regardless of what you try. Instead, it's a genuine, lasting shift in how much of your own peace remains contingent on her behavior, her acknowledgement, or her eventual insight at all. You don't need her to recognize this pattern in herself in order for your own recognition of it to matter completely and permanently. You don't need her accountability, however deserved, in order to finally, fully trust your own memory of exactly what actually happened between you across all those years. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos.